The unexpected visitor. The wind howled through the barren wastelands, sending a chilling gust through the cracks of John's cabin. Inside, John sat alone by the dim fire, staring blankly at the flickering flames. It had been months since he last saw another soul. The war between humans and the Zalari had ended, but the scars remained. John had chosen this desolate place to hide from his past, and from the memories that haunted him every night. Suddenly a faint knock echoed through the silence. John's eyes snapped toward the door. He frowned. Nobody ever came here. Grabbing his old blaster, he moved cautiously, his boots creaking against the wooden floor. He swung the door open, and his jaw dropped. Standing before him was a young, slender Zalari woman. Her skin was a pale shade of lavender, her long white hair tangled and windswept. Glowing orange markings ran down her cheeks like tears. In her arms she cradled a small child, shivering violently. Beside her, another child clung to her leg, eyes wide and terrified. John tightened his grip on the blaster, his expression hard. "What do you want?" The woman's lips trembled as she struggled to speak. "Please," she whispered, her voice weak and shaky. "I will warm your bed, human. My children need a father." John's heart hammered in his chest. He knew what she was asking. A place to stay, a protector. But she was Zalari, the same race that had killed his squadron, the same race he had fought against in the war. The child in her arms coughed, his tiny body shaking violently. The woman held him closer, her eyes pleading. John hesitated. The logical part of his brain screamed to shut the door, to tell her to leave. But the other part, the part that remembered the faces of fallen friends, the screams of dying children, that part couldn't look away. "Come inside," John said gruffly, stepping aside. The woman's eyes widened, a mix of relief and fear flashing across her face. She stepped inside cautiously, her children clinging to her as though the walls might close in at any moment. John closed the door, shutting out the bitter wind. The cabin was small and sparse. A single bed in the corner, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and a small stove where the last embers of a fire were dying. The air was stale and cold, but it was shelter. "Sit," John said, nodding toward the chair. The woman lowered herself onto it, pulling her children close. "What's your name?" John asked, his voice gruff. He wasn't used to talking to anyone, let alone a Zalari. "Lyra," she said softly, her eyes fixed on the floor. John watched as she shivered, her thin clothes barely protecting her from the cold. The child in her arms was still shaking, his breath shallow and weak. "Is he sick?" John asked, gesturing toward the boy. Lyra nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "He hasn't eaten in days. We had nowhere else to go." John's jaw clenched. He walked over to the cabinet, pulling out a tin of dried meat and a small loaf of stale bread. He placed them on the table and stepped back. "Eat," he said, crossing his arms. Lyra's hands trembled as she reached for the food, breaking off small pieces and feeding them to her children first. They devoured the bread hungrily, their eyes darting around the room as though expecting the food to vanish. John leaned against the wall, watching them in silence. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. A Zalari woman, begging for help, in his home. During the war, he had seen Zalari soldiers tearing through human settlements, burning homes, killing innocents. But Lyra didn't look like a soldier. She looked like a desperate mother. When the children had eaten their fill, Lyra looked up at John. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. John said nothing. He couldn't shake the image of her standing in the freezing wind, her children clinging to her, her eyes hollow and desperate. "You said your children need a father," John said, his voice low. "What did you mean?" Lyra swallowed hard, her eyes dropping to the floor. "My husband, he was killed in the war. We were left with nothing. I tried to survive, to protect them, but—" Her voice broke, and she pressed her lips together to hold back the sob. John's jaw tightened. The war that had taken so much, from both sides. "You're not staying here for free," John said finally, his voice rough. "If you want to stay, you'll work, clean, cook, help out, understand?" Lyra nodded quickly, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I will. I promise." John pushed away from the wall, moving to the bed. He grabbed the single blanket he owned and tossed it toward Lyra. "Take it. You and the kids can sleep on the floor tonight." Lyra pulled the blanket over her children, wrapping it around them tightly. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. John turned away, walking to the window and staring out into the dark wasteland. The wind howled, a haunting reminder of the war that had taken everything from him. And now, inside his cabin, he was faced with a new kind of battle, one that challenged not just his survival, but his very humanity. Outside, the wind roared, like a ghost, and John couldn't help but wonder if he had just invited the enemy into his home, or if he had just taken the first step toward redemption. A fragile alliance. The morning sun cast pale light through the dusty windows of John's cabin. Lyra was already awake, her eyes heavy with exhaustion as she crouched by the stove, attempting to light a fire. The children huddled beneath the single blanket on the floor, their tiny bodies still shivering from the cold night. John sat at the table, silently watching her struggle. The Zalari woman was clearly out of her element. Her slender fingers fumbled with the flint, her breaths coming in short, frustrated gasps. "Let me do it," John said gruffly, pushing back his chair. Lyra flinched, her eyes darting up to him. Despite his stern expression, she nodded, stepping aside. John crouched beside the stove, striking the flint with practiced ease. Flames flickered to life, casting an orange glow over the room. "Thank you," Lyra whispered, her voice barely audible. John didn't respond. He stood up, brushing his hands against his pants. "There's water outside," he said, nodding toward the metal barrel near the door. "You can wash up, and if you're going to stay here, you need to pull your weight." Lyra swallowed, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I will. I can clean, cook, whatever you need." John's eyes narrowed. "Can you fight?" Lyra hesitated, her eyes flashing with something dark and unreadable. "I can protect my children." "That's not what I asked," John said, his voice sharper now. "I asked if you can fight." A moment of silence hung heavy between them. Then Lyra straightened her back, meeting his gaze. "I was a healer," she said, her voice steady. "I don't fight." John grunted, his jaw tightening. He couldn't shake the image of Zalari soldiers storming through his village, their eyes devoid of mercy. He had seen them tear through human defenses without hesitation, but Lyra's eyes weren't the eyes of a soldier. They were the eyes of a survivor. "Fine," John muttered, turning away. "Just stay out of my way." Hours later, Lyra knelt beside the sleeping children, her fingers brushing over their hair. The younger boy, Siren, whimpered in his sleep, his brow covered in sweat. Lyra's heart twisted painfully. John entered the cabin, a bucket of water, sloshing in his hands. "What's wrong with him?" he asked, setting the bucket down with a heavy thud. Lyra pressed her lips together, cradling Siren closer. "He's burning up. He's been sick for days." John frowned, crouching down to get a better look. The boy's skin was flushed, his breathing labored. John's military training kicked in. "You said you're a healer," he said, grabbing a cloth and soaking it in the water. "Why isn't he getting better?" Lyra's hands trembled as she wrung the cloth. "I have nothing left, no herbs, no medicine. I used everything to keep them alive." John clenched his jaw, his mind flashing back to the countless wounded soldiers he had tried to save during the war. He had seen this fever before, a common infection among those living in the wastelands. "We need to cool him down," John said, his tone firm. "Keep his temperature low and I'll see what supplies I can find." Lyra nodded, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "Thank you." John didn't respond. He grabbed his coat and headed outside, the cold wind biting through his clothes. As he walked toward the storage shed, he couldn't shake the memory of Lyra's plea. "My children need a father." The words echoed in his mind like a haunting refrain. Why had he let them in? Was it guilt? Pity? Or was it something deeper, a desperate need to feel human again? Inside the cabin, Lyra gently pressed the cool cloth against Siran's burning forehead. The boy whimpered, his tiny fingers clutching her hand. "Mama," he whispered weakly, "I'm so cold." Lyra's heart ached. "I know, baby. Just rest. Mama's here." The older child, Leary, sat nearby, her knees drawn to her chest. Her wide eyes watched Lyra intently. "Mama," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Why, did that human help us, aren't they the enemy?" Lyra swallowed, her throat tightening. "Not all of them," she said, her voice soft. "Some still have hearts." Leary frowned, glancing toward the door. "But what if he changes his mind?" Lyra didn't answer. She couldn't. Because the truth was, she had no idea if John would keep helping them, or if he would throw them back into the cold wasteland once Siran got better. John returned an hour later, his hands full of old medical supplies. He dropped them onto the table, his face set in a grim line. "This is all I could find," he said, tossing a half-empty bottle of fever medicine onto the table. Lyra's eyes widened. "Where did you get this?" John hesitated, his gaze hardening. "I kept it after the war. Figured I might need it one day." Lyra's eyes searched his face, but John looked away, refusing to meet her gaze. Without another word, he handed her the medicine. "Give him a dose, it should help." Lyra nodded, her hand shaking as she administered the medicine to Siran. The boy's breathing slowed, his tiny body relaxing as the fever began to break. John watched from the corner of the room, his arms crossed over his chest. He wanted to say something, anything, to ease the tension that hung heavy in the air, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he just stood there, a silent guardian in the shadows, his eyes fixed on the fragile family huddled together by the fire. And for the first time in months, John felt something stir deep within him, a flicker of purpose, a glimmer of humanity he thought had died on the battlefield. But as he looked at Lyra, who was now watching him with a strange mix of gratitude and fear, he couldn't help but wonder, was he protecting them? Or was he just protecting himself from the darkness that had been consuming him all this time? The unspoken pain night fell like a heavy curtain, plunging the wasteland into darkness. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the scent of burning wood and stale smoke. John sat by the window, his eyes scanning the barren landscape, his mind far away. Behind him, Lyra knelt by Siran's side, her fingers gently brushing the damp hair from his feverish forehead. The boy's breathing had steadied, the medicine finally taking effect. Leary, the older child, sat curled up beside her mother, her eyes wide and watchful. John's gaze flicked toward them, a knot forming in his stomach. He couldn't shake the memory of Siran's labored breaths, the way Lyra had clutched him to her chest as if holding on to her last shred of sanity. But it wasn't just the boy's suffering that haunted him. It was the haunted look in Lyra's eyes, the unspoken pain that lingered there like a shadow. John cleared his throat, his voice rough. "He'll be fine now," he said, more to himself than to her. Lyra nodded, not looking up. "Thank you." John clenched his jaw. There was something about the way she said those words, as if she didn't really believe them, as if gratitude was foreign to her. He stood up, grabbing his old military coat from the hook. "I need some air." Outside, the wind bit through his coat like icy knives. John stepped onto the porch, his breath fogging the frigid air. The stars stretched out above him, cold and indifferent. He lit a cigarette, taking a long, slow drag. The bitter smoke filled his lungs, grounding him, but his mind refused to settle. Why had he let them in? Why was he helping her, Azalari, the enemy? The very people who had slaughtered his friends, burned his village, and left him to rot in this godforsaken wasteland. He closed his eyes, the memories rushing back. Explosions, screaming, the acrid scent of burning flesh. And Lyra's eyes, staring up at him with that same haunting expression. "John?" John flinched, nearly dropping the cigarette. Lyra stood behind him, her slender form framed by the orange glow from the cabin. Her arms were wrapped around herself, her eyes dark and unreadable. "Couldn't sleep?" he muttered, looking away. Lyra stepped closer, her bare feet crunching against the frosty wooden planks. "Saran is resting now," she said softly. You saved him." John scoffed, flicking ash into the wind. "Don't thank me. I didn't do it for you." Lyra's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. For a moment, the only sound was the wind howling through the empty plains. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and strained. "Do you think I'm a monster?" John's brow furrowed. "What?" Lyra hugged herself tighter, her eyes fixed on the ground. "You look at me like I'm the enemy, like I could turn on you at any moment." John's jaw clenched. "You're Zalari. You people killed my friends." Lyra's shoulders sagged, a shuddering breath escaping her lips. "And your people killed my husband." John's heart lurched. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Lyra's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she continued, her voice breaking. "My husband wasn't a soldier. He was a farmer. He loved the land, the crops, he loved his children. When the humans came, he tried to protect us. But they shot him anyway. Said he was hiding soldiers." John swallowed, the cigarette forgotten, between his fingers. "I didn't..." Lyra's lips trembled. "You think I'm the enemy. You think I'm dangerous. But I'm just a mother trying to keep her children alive, that's all." John stared at her, his mind spinning. He wanted to argue, to tell her that her people started the war, that they were the monsters. But when he looked into her eyes, all he saw was pain, the same pain he saw every time he looked in the mirror. A sudden cry echoed from inside the cabin. Lyra's head snapped up, her eyes widening. "Saran!" She rushed inside, John following close behind. Saran lay on the floor, thrashing in his sleep, his small fists clenched, his face contorted in fear. Lyra dropped to her knees, gathering him into her arms. "Shh, shh, it's okay," she whispered, rocking him gently. "Mama's here." John hovered nearby, his fists clenched. He felt useless, like a ghost in his own home. Leary watched them from the corner, her eyes dark and empty. "He has bad dreams," she said quietly, her voice devoid of emotion. "Every night." John swallowed, the knot in his stomach tightening. He knew those dreams, the ones that tore through sleep like a blade, the ones that never let go. Lyra continued to rock Saran, her soft melodic voice filling the cabin with a lullaby. It was a song John didn't recognize, a Zalari lullaby. The words were foreign, the melody haunting and sad. John turned away, his eyes burning. He felt like an intruder, like he didn't belong here, like he didn't deserve to be here. But as he reached for the door, Lyra's voice stopped him. "John?" He froze, his hand hovering over the door handle. Lyra looked up, her eyes wet and pleading. "Thank you for helping us, even if you hate me." John's throat tightened. He couldn't speak. He couldn't even look at her. Without another word, he stepped outside, the cold wind hitting him like a slap. He took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to force down the emotions clawing at his chest. But as he stared out into the empty wasteland, the only thing he could hear was Lyra's voice, singing that haunting lullaby, a song of loss, of pain, of a world torn apart by war. And for the first time in years, John felt something warm and wet slide down his cheek. He wiped it away angrily, cursing himself. But the tears kept coming, and he couldn't stop them, because Lyra was right. He did hate her, but he also hated himself. Trust on thin ice. The fire crackled softly in the corner of the cabin, casting wavering shadows against the wooden walls. Lyra sat cross-legged on the floor, her children huddled close under the thin blanket. Siren slept fitfully, his tiny body, still weak from the fever, while Leary sat silently, her eyes fixed on the flickering flames. John paced near the window, his jaw clenched, eyes darting toward the horizon. The cold wind outside howled like a restless ghost, a haunting reminder of what was coming. "They'll be here soon," John muttered, his voice a low growl. Lyra looked up, her eyes wide and questioning. "Who?" John turned to face her, his expression grim. "Scavengers." Hours earlier, John had been out near the old watchtower scouting for supplies. That's when he saw them, 3 men wrapped in ragged coats, armed with rusty rifles. They were human, but they moved like predators, eyes scanning the empty wasteland with a hunger that sent a chill down John's spine. He had seen men like them before, survivors of the war, men with nothing left to lose. Men who would do anything for a meal, a warm bed, or worse. Now they were headed toward the cabin. Lyra's hands tightened around her children. "What do they want?" John's eyes darkened. "Anything they can take." Leary's small voice cut through the tense silence. "Are they bad people?" John's jaw worked, his fists clenching and unclenching. "Yes." Lyra's face paled. "What do we do?" John stepped forward, dropping to one knee in front of her. His eyes met hers, his gaze intense. "Listen to me," he said, his voice firm. "If they come inside, you don't say a word. You don't look at them. You stay silent and stay hidden, understand?" Lyra nodded, her eyes glistening with fear. "And you," John said, turning to Leary, "you protect your brother, no matter what." Leary swallowed, her little face tightening in determination. "I will." John rose to his feet, grabbing his old rifle from the corner. The weapon felt heavy in his hands, a reminder of the war, of the things he had done. But now he wasn't fighting aliens. He was fighting his own kind. The knock came just as the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the wasteland into icy darkness. John's spine straightened, his grip on the rifle tightening. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. Another knock, louder, more insistent. John glanced over his shoulder. Lyra and the children were hidden behind the overturned table, their eyes wide with fear. John stepped forward and opened the door a crack. 3 men stood outside, their eyes cold and calculating. The leader, a burly man with a thick beard and scar across his cheek, grinned. "Evenin', friend," he said, his voice oily and smooth. "Got room for a few travelers?" John didn't smile. "No room. Keep moving." The man's grin widened, his eyes narrowing. "Come on now. We're just looking for some shelter, maybe some food." John shook his head. "Ain't got any to spare." The man's gaze flicked over John's shoulder, as though searching for movement inside the cabin. "Funny," he said, his tone darkening. "Thought I heard voices." John's heart pounded. "You didn't." The man leaned closer, his breath reeking of stale liquor. "You sure about that?" John met his eyes unblinking. "You heard wrong." For a tense moment, the air between them hung heavy and still. Then the man stepped back, his grin fading. "Fine," he said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "We'll be on our way." John watched them turn and walk away, their footsteps crunching against the icy ground. But just as John was about to close the door, the man stopped. He turned back, his eyes gleaming with a dangerous light. "Oh," he said, feigning casualness. "One more thing." Before John could react, the man's fist shot forward, slamming into John's jaw. The world spun, and John hit the floor hard, the rifle clattering out of reach. The men barged inside, slamming the door behind them. The leader towered over John, his boot pressing down against John's chest. "Told you," the man sneered, leaning down. "I heard voices." Lyra's heart pounded as she clutched Siren close, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Leary squeezed her hand, her tiny fingers trembling. They could hear the men's voices, the sound of John grunting in pain. "Mama," Leary whispered, her eyes wide and terrified. "What do we do?" Lyra swallowed, her mind racing. The table. They hid behind offered little protection. If the men searched the cabin, they would be found. And then, Lyra's gaze fell on the old metal rod leaning against the wall, the one John had been using to stoke the fire. She met Leary's eyes, her expression hardening, Stay here, she said, her voice a fierce whisper. No matter what. Leary nodded, tears welling in her eyes. Lyra took a deep breath and rose to her feet, the metal rod gripped tightly in her hand. John struggled beneath the man's boot, gasping for air. The other two men were rifling through his belongings, tossing blankets and supplies onto the floor. Not much here, one of them said, kicking over a chair. Where's the food, old man? John's teeth clenched. There isn't any. The leader chuckled, leaning closer. Liar. Just then, a sharp crack echoed through the cabin. The leader's eyes widened in shock as the metal rod connected with his skull, sending him sprawling to the floor. Lyra stood over him, breathing hard, the rod trembling in her hands. The other two men whirled around, eyes blazing. You... Before they could react, John lunged forward, tackling one of them to the ground. The two men grappled, fists flying. Lyra swung the rod again, her eyes wild, her movements desperate. The man she struck crumpled to the floor, groaning in pain. John managed to pin the last man down, his fists slamming into the man's face again and again until he stopped moving. Breathless, John staggered to his feet, blood trickling from his split lip. Lyra stood across the room, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with adrenaline. John's gaze locked onto hers. For a moment, they just stared at each other, the only sound the ragged gasps of their breathing. You fought for me, John said, his voice rough. Lyra dropped the metal rod, her knees giving out as she collapsed to the floor. No, she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. I fought for my children. John swallowed, his chest tight. He moved toward her, reaching out a hand. Lyra took it, her grip surprisingly strong. In that moment, something unspoken passed. Between them, a fragile understanding, a flicker of trust amidst the chaos. But outside, the wind howled like a wolf, reminding them both that the real danger was still out there, lurking in the darkness. A human's heart. The wind howled like a restless spirit outside the cabin, clawing at the wooden walls and rattling the window panes. Inside, the fire crackled softly, its dim light casting shifting shadows across the room. John sat at the table, staring blankly at the floor. His knuckles were raw and bruised, blood crusting under his fingernails. The three men were gone, banished back into the wasteland, staggering away with bruised faces and empty hands. But their words still echoed in his mind. You're protecting a Zilari, one of them had spat, eyes wild with disbelief. You're no better than them. John's jaw clenched, his fists tightening until his knuckles turned white. Was he a traitor? Had he really chosen to protect the enemy over his own kind? Behind him, Lyra moved silently, cleaning the bloodstains off the floor. Her hands shook as she scrubbed, her jaw set in a determined line. The children sat nearby, wrapped in the thin blanket, their eyes wide and haunted. Siran was still weak, his feverish eyes fluttering open and closed as he lay against his sister's lap. Leary stroked his hair, her small face blank, as though she were somewhere far away. John's chest tightened. He couldn't shake the image of Lyra swinging that metal rod, her eyes wild and desperate, her hands trembling but unyielding. In that moment, she hadn't been Zilari. She had just been a mother protecting her children. You didn't have to do that, John said, his voice rough. Lyra didn't look up. They would have killed you. John swallowed, the knot in his throat tightening. Why do you care? Lyra's hand stilled, the rag clenched between her fingers. Why do you? John's jaw clenched. He had no answer. Later that night, after the children had finally fallen asleep, John sat by the window staring out into the endless darkness. Lyra sat across from him, her knees drawn to her chest, her arms wrapped tightly around her legs. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy, filled with unspoken words and unhealed wounds. Finally, Lyra broke the silence, her voice barely a whisper. I had a brother once. John's eyes flicked to her, surprise flashing across his face. Lyra's gaze remained fixed on the floor, her eyes distant. He was younger than me, smart, brave. He always wanted to be a pilot. Said he'd fly us away from the war. Her lips twisted into a bitter smile. But the war found him first. John swallowed, his throat dry. What happened? Lyra's eyes darkened. A human patrol ship. They said he was smuggling weapons for the resistance. They dragged him away. I never saw him again. John's fists clenched in his lap. I'm sorry. Lyra's eyes finally met his, and there was something in them that made John's heart ache. A raw, aching grief that mirrored his own. Are you? She asked, her voice soft but sharp. Are you really sorry? Or are you just saying it because you feel guilty? John looked away, his jaw clenched. I didn't do those things. But you didn't stop them either, Lyra said, her voice cold. Did you? The words hit John like a slap and he flinched. Memories flashed through his mind. Human soldiers marching through the Zalari village, homes burning, children screaming. And John, standing there, gun in hand, doing nothing. No, he said, his voice thick with shame. I didn't. Silence fell between them, heavy and suffocating. Hours later, as dawn began to creep over the horizon, Lyra rose from her spot on the floor and moved to the window. Her fingers pressed against the glass, her eyes distant and hollow. John watched her, his heart pounding. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of men who had lost everything, men who had nothing left to live for. Are you going to leave? He asked, the words escaping before he could stop them. Lyra's shoulders tensed. Should I? John swallowed, his chest tightening. If you go out there, they'll find you, and the kids. Lyra's eyes flicked to the sleeping children, her expression torn. I can't stay here forever. John's heart hammered against his ribs. Then stay for now. Lyra turned to face him, her expression guarded. Why? John stood up, his fists clenched at his sides. Because I need you to. Lyra's eyes narrowed. Need me? Or need to feel like a hero again? John's jaw tightened. I'm not a hero. No, Lyra said, her voice sharp. You're just a man trying to fix what he broke. John flinched, the words cutting, deep. But Lyra didn't stop. You think taking us in makes you a good man? She continued, her eyes blazing. You think giving us scraps of food and shelter erases everything your people did to mine? John's fists trembled. I'm not them. Aren't you? Lyra said, stepping closer. You stood by and watched while they destroyed us. You did nothing. Just like you're doing nothing now. John's breath caught in his throat. I'm trying. Lyra's face softened, the fire in her eyes flickering out. Then try harder. They stood there, inches apart, the air between them heavy and charged. John could feel her breath against his skin, could see the tears glistening in her eyes. For a moment he wanted to reach out, to touch her, to say something, anything, that would make it all right. But before he could, Lyra stepped back, the distance between them growing once more. Go to sleep, John, she said, her voice flat. Tomorrow's another day. John watched as she walked away, her slender form sinking down beside her children, her arms wrapping protectively around them. He stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where she had been. The ache in his chest was sharp and deep, a wound that refused to heal. Because Lyra was right. He was trying. But maybe trying wasn't enough. The battle at the doorstep. The sun hung low in the icy sky, casting long shadows across the barren wasteland. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with tension. Lyra paced back and forth, her eyes darting to the door every few seconds. Siren lay, in a fitful sleep, his tiny body twitching as if haunted by nightmares. Leary sat beside him, her small hand clutching her brother's, her face expressionless. John stood near the window, rifle slung over his shoulder. His eyes scanned the horizon, every nerve in his body coiled tight. He could feel it. The storm was coming. What did they say? Lyra asked, her voice trembling. John didn't turn around. They're coming back, he said flatly, with more men. Lyra's breath hitched. How many? John's jaw clenched. Too many. Earlier that morning, John had gone to the old watchtower to see if the scavengers had truly left. But instead of empty wasteland, he found a camp, a makeshift base where the 3 men were now joined by 7 others. And the leader, the one Lyra had struck with the metal rod, had been pacing back and forth, rage burning in his eyes. "That freak and her kids are dead," he had shouted to the others. "And the human who took them in? He's dead too." Now John stood in the cabin replaying those words over and over, his mind churning. He had fought in wars. He had survived battles, but he had never been outnumbered. Like this. Maybe we should run," Lyra said, her eyes wild. "We can take the children and hide in the caves." John shook his head, his eyes cold. "They'll find you, and when they do, they won't just take supplies." Lyra shivered, her arms wrapping around herself. "Then what do we do?" John met her gaze, his expression grim. "We fight." John moved swiftly, his movements sharp and precise. He pushed the old wooden table against the door, piling chairs and crates behind it to form a barricade. Lyra worked beside him, her hands shaking but steady. "Leary," John said, crouching down to the little girl's level. "Take your brother and hide in the crawl space under the floorboards. Stay quiet. No matter what you hear, you don't. Come out. Understand?" Leary's eyes were wide, but she nodded. "Yes." Lyra knelt beside her daughter, pulling her into a tight hug. "Stay with Siren. Keep him safe." Leary hugged her mother back, her small arms trembling. "What about you, Mama?" Lyra swallowed hard, her eyes locking with John's. "We'll be fine," she said, forcing a smile. "We'll protect you." Moments later, the children were hidden beneath the floorboards, the hatch covered by a ragged old rug. John and Lyra stood by the barricaded door, weapons in hand. John handed Lyra a small knife, his expression grim. "If they get through." Lyra took the knife, her jaw set. "They won't." John nodded. For a moment, they stood there, inches apart, the weight of everything unspoken hanging heavy in the air. Then the silence shattered. A gunshot rang out, splintering the air. The cabin door rattled violently as fists pounded against the wood. "Open up!" The leader's voice snarled from the other side. "You made a big mistake, hero." John raised his rifle, aiming it at the door. "Go away," he shouted. "You, come in here, you die." The leader laughed, a harsh, guttural sound. "You and what army, John? You're outnumbered." John's heart pounded in his chest. He knew the man was right, but he couldn't back down now. The first blow came hard. A battering ram slamming into the door, cracking the wooden frame. The barricade held, but barely. John fired a shot through the door, the blast echoing through the cabin. A scream followed, and John felt a sick, grim satisfaction. One down. But there were more, too many more. The door shuddered again, the wood splintering. Lyra's breaths came in short, sharp bursts, her knuckles white as she gripped the knife. "John!" she shouted, her eyes wide. "They're coming through!" John's mind raced. They couldn't hold the door much longer, and if the men got inside, it was over. Suddenly, an idea sparked in his mind. A desperate, reckless idea. "Lyra," he said, grabbing her arm. "The lanterns. The oil." Lyra's eyes widened as she understood. "Are you sure?" John nodded, his eyes fierce. "It's the only way." They moved quickly, grabbing the old metal lanterns and dousing the floorboards with oil. The sharp, acrid scent filled the air, mixing with the scent of fear and desperation. John grabbed a match, his hands shaking. "When they come through, we light it up." Lyra swallowed, her jaw set. "And us?" John's eyes darkened. "We get to the back room. It might hold long enough for us to escape through the window." Lyra nodded, her grip tightening on the knife. "I trust you." The door crashed open with a deafening crack, splinters flying through the air. The leader stormed in, rifle raised, eyes blazing with fury. "There you are, you son of a—" John struck the match. Flames roared to life, licking up the oil-soaked floorboards. The scavengers screamed as the fire spread, the heat blistering and intense. "Go!" John shouted, grabbing Lyra's hand and dragging her toward the back room. Behind them, The cabin became a roaring inferno, flames consuming everything in their path. John shoved Lyra through the small window, the cold air a shocking contrast to the searing heat. He scrambled out after her just as the roof caved in with a deafening crash. They hit the ground hard, rolling in the dirt. Smoke billowed up into the night sky, the cabin reduced to a blazing ruin. John coughed, his lungs burning, his eyes stinging, with smoke. Beside him, Lyra pushed herself up, her face smudged with soot and sweat. "The children," she gasped, her eyes wild. John's heart dropped. He staggered to his feet, his legs shaking as he rushed to the hatch. Leary's small, soot-streaked face emerged, her eyes wide with terror. In her arms, Saran whimpered, his face pressed against his sister's neck. "They're okay," John said, relief washing over him like a wave. But as he looked back at the burning cabin, the reality of what they had lost hit him like a punch to the gut. Their shelter was gone. Their supplies were gone. And now, with the scavengers dead or scattered, every human within miles would know that John was harboring a Zalari woman and her children. Lyra staggered to her feet, clutching her children to her chest. She looked up at John, her eyes hollow. "What now?" John stared at the horizon, his jaw clenched, his fists trembling. "Now," he said, his voice like gravel, "we run." A new beginning. The cold wind bit through John's coat as he trudged through the wasteland, his boots crunching against the frozen ground. The sky was a muted gray, clouds hanging low like a heavy curtain. Behind him, Lyra carried Siren, her slender arms wrapped tightly around her son as she fought to keep her footing. Leary walked beside her, her small hand gripping her mother's coat, her eyes dark and haunted. John's cabin was nothing but ashes now, a blackened ruin smoldering in the distance. The scent of burnt wood and smoke lingered in the air, clinging to their clothes and hair. They had nothing left, no shelter, no food, nowhere to go. But they were alive. John glanced back at Lyra. Her lavender skin was smeared with soot, her white hair tangled and wild. Siren whimpered in her arms, his feverish eyes half closed. Leary's face was a mask of exhaustion, her cheeks hollow, her lips chapped and dry. John's jaw clenched. This was his fault. He should have been prepared. He should have seen it coming. "You okay?" he asked, his voice gruff. Lyra nodded, her eyes fixed on the ground. "I can keep going." John's eyes fell on Siren, whose breathing was shallow and uneven. "He can't." Lyra swallowed, her gaze lifting to meet John's. "What do we do?" John scanned the horizon, his mind racing. "There's a human outpost 10 miles east," he said. "They might have food, medicine." Lyra's eyes widened, fear flashing across her face. "Humans?" John nodded, his expression grim. "If we stay out here, we die." The journey was grueling. The wind cut through them like a knife, carrying with it the scent of death and decay. The wasteland was littered with the remnants of war, shattered vehicles, burned-out shelters, and the skeletal remains of those who hadn't made it. John carried Siran now, the boy's tiny body limp against his chest. Lyra walked beside him, her steps heavy, her eyes glazed with exhaustion. Leary clung to her mother's hand, her lips quivering as she fought to stay awake. "How much farther?" Lyra asked, her voice thin and weak. John squinted against the wind, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Not far." But even as he said it, his legs felt like lead, each step harder than the last. Suddenly, a shadow loomed ahead, a dark figure standing atop a ridge. John's heart skipped a beat. "Soldiers, stay. Behind me," John said, his voice low. He lowered Saran to the ground, his hand reaching for the rifle slung over his back. The figure stepped forward, and John's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a soldier. It was a woman, human, wrapped in a thick fur coat, her face half hidden by a hood. Her eyes were hard and piercing, her lips set in a thin line. "You lost?" she asked, her voice rough. John straightened, his body tense. "We're looking for the outpost." The woman's eyes flicked to Lyra and the children, her expression darkening. "You're traveling with Zalari?" John's jaw clenched. "They're with me." The woman's eyes narrowed. You know what they did to us, right? What they did to our people? John met her gaze, his eyes cold. And I know what we did to theirs. The woman's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching beneath her skin. For a moment, John thought she might raise a weapon, but then she stepped aside, nodding toward the east. The outpost is 2 miles that way, she said, her voice flat. But you're on your own. They're not going to help you with them. John swallowed, nodding. Thanks. The outpost loomed ahead, a collection of makeshift structures surrounded by a tall barbed wire fence. Smoke rose from chimneys and the scent of cooking meat drifted through the air. John's stomach clenched. It had been days since they'd eaten. Stay close, he said, his eyes darting around as they approached the gate. A guard stepped forward, his rifle aimed at John's chest. Stop right there. John raised his hands, his expression calm. We need food and medicine. The boy's sick. The guard's eyes fell on Lyra, his face twisting in disgust. You brought aliens here? John stepped in front of Lyra, his stance firm. They're with me. Not anymore, the guard sneered. Turn around, you're not welcome here. John's fists clenched, rage boiling beneath his skin. But before he could speak, Lyra stepped forward, her eyes locked onto the guard. Please, she said, her voice breaking. My son is dying. The guard's eyes flicked to Siren, whose eyes were glassy, his skin pale and clammy. For a brief moment, the guard's expression softened, but then his eyes hardened again. Not my problem, he said, raising his rifle. Now get out of here before I... A gunshot echoed through the air. John flinched, his heart pounding. But it wasn't the guard who fired. Behind them, the woman from the ridge stepped forward, a smoking pistol in her hand. The guard dropped to the ground, clutching his leg, blood pooling beneath him. The woman's eyes met John's, a smirk tugging at her lips. Guess I changed my mind. John's jaw dropped. Why? The woman shrugged, holstering her pistol. Because that kid doesn't deserve to die, and neither do you. She stepped forward, her hand reaching for Siren. Get inside. Now. John didn't hesitate. He grabbed Lyra's hand and pulled her through the gate. Behind them, the guard's pained screams echoed through the air. Inside, the woman led them to a small, dimly lit shelter. She set Saran down on a cot, her hands moving quickly as she checked his pulse, her brow furrowed. He's burning up, she muttered, reaching for a bottle of medicine. Lyra hovered nearby, her eyes locked onto her son, her hands shaking. John stood in the doorway, his fists clenched, his mind racing. Everything had changed so fast. The cabin was gone. The scavengers were dead. And now they were at the mercy of a stranger. The woman met John's eyes, her expression hard. You're risking a lot bringing them here, she said. People hate Zeleri. They see them as the enemy. John swallowed, his throat dry. They're not the enemy. The woman snorted, wiping her hands on a rag. Then what are they? John looked over at Lyra, who was now cradling Siren's hand, her eyes filled with silent desperation. They're my family, John said, his voice firm, and I'm going to protect them. The woman's eyes flicked to Lyra, then back to John. For a moment, her expression softened. Then she nodded. Good, she said, because you're going to need all the help you can get.